Hi, everyone. So I'm going to try and keep this to 15 or 20 minutes and really just highlight what's important. But this is the story of Alexander the Great, who we've mentioned a few different times in class thus far for reasons that you'll see. But also be aware that Alexander's empire, or so-called empire, and his importance really is also matched with the term Hellenistic age or the Hellenistic legacy. Hellenistic coming from the word Hellene, which is the way that the Greeks refer to themselves, if you recall from Thucydides' document. Okay, so let's start. So Alexander himself wasn't actually a product of Greece. He originated from the area north of Greece, which is Macedonia, and during this period, they never fell under Greek control specifically. They always had their own king, Alexander's father, Philip, being the most famous. And after the devastation of civil war brought on by Athens' abuse of the Delian League, what we call the Peloponnesian War, which dragged on for 27 years, both Athens and Sparta, the two powerhouses of Greece, among the other city-states, really had become weak and fell vulnerable to Philip, Alexander's father, from the north. And Philip started to conquer territory, as you can see from this map. At the time of Philip's death, there was only actually a small territory of Greece left to be conquered, and that would fall to Alexander. What Alexander did was not only conquer the rest of the Balkan Peninsula, but of course famously turn eastward and brought what remained of the Persian Empire under his control. And he moved his way into Mesopotamia, the heartland of civilization, the Tigris and Euphrates River Valley. He came down into Greece. The Greeks actually welcomed him as a liberator because they had been under the control of the Persians for so long. And then he swept across Asia into the heartland of Persian territory, their capital at Persepolis, if you recall, and as far as northern India. If you remember when we talked about the Vedic age, it was Alexander who pushed his way into northern India and created that dynamic that would allow Chandragupta Maurya in the years after to bring all of the Hindu priests, those Brahmin priests, under his control. Here's another view of the extent of Alexander's empire. And I like this map because you get a chance to see the topography of the region. We know that obviously Mesopotamia and the Nile River Valley were a heartland of farming, but as you can see, he moved through the mountainous region of Central Asia and pushed his way up to areas that would have been at the border of modern-day China. And all along the way, of course, creating cities and spreading information. As you would imagine, Alexander must have been a skilled military tactician, which he was. You know, by conquering the Persians who really outnumbered him, he really proved his might. But also, as you would imagine, as he moved across this area with lightning speed in the space of 12 years and conquering large territories, there was all kinds of stories that he left in his wake, maybe the most famous being Alexander slashing the Gordian knot. Gordian knot is a term used still today to refer to a problem that doesn't seem to have a solution. And in this story, Alexander faced with this knot that could not be untied. Supposedly, there's a lot of conflict as to whether this actually happened, but Alexander supposedly just slashed the knot. And if you think about that story and the message from it, the idea was that Alexander could do the impossible, which, you know, he near did in conquering this massive territory in such a short amount of time. There aren't many pictures of, or I shouldn't say pictures, I should say images or scenes that capture Alexander in battle, but this is perhaps the most famous. If you were to Google Alexander the Great, this is probably the image that will come up. I want to share it with you just so you, if you should see it again, you had some kind of historical reference. So this is supposed to be Alexander in battle fighting the numerous Persian forces. Most often we see Alexander in this way. And as you're looking at this, I'm hoping what comes to mind is that, oh, wow, this looks like a Greek statue. And that's exactly what it was. Alexander, if you recall from our conversation in class, was a student of Aristotle. The story goes that he slept with a copy of the Iliad under his pillow at the time. He was really, truly, even though a Greek conqueror, a lover of Greek culture. And every stop along his way, as he created cities and encouraged new ideas, those new ideas were founded often in Greek principles. I also like this slide for the coins that you see on the top there. Alexander, in the true tradition of empire building, recognized the need for some kind of currency to promote trade and exchange. And so, of course, just like the cities he created all named after him, the coins also had his image. So at the time of Alexander's death, the greatest extent of his empire would stretch from Macedonia and the Balkan Peninsula in Eastern Europe, south to the Nile River Valley, and then east across to Central Asia, and if you notice, even the Indus River Valley in what is modern-day Pakistan. The sad part of the story for Alexander, of course, is that once he reaches the Indus Valley, his troops are really reluctant to go any further. They've moved so fast and over such a large territory that they're becoming unnerved, and they don't want to travel any further. And so, facing near mutiny, Alexander stops, and in his travel back to Eastern Europe, he dies from disease. And at the time of his death, he didn't see it coming, and he had no plan for what would happen next. And so after his death, his empire was split among some of his major generals. And you can see here from the colors, right, the green being the famous Seleucid kingdom, which we talked about when we discussed the Persian empires, the Seleucids, one of those later Persian empires. As you would imagine, the Persians never truly felt that this was their people ruling them because they were Alexander's former generals. And then the most famous one, of course, the one that we really will talk about, is the Ptolemaic kingdom that was centered around ancient Egypt with its capital at Alexandria. This is where we see Cleopatra's family come to a position of power. Cleopatra was a successor of Ptolemy, who was Alexander's famous general. Here is really where the story becomes important. Ironically, although Alexander is this unbelievable military tactician who creates this massive empire, in the end, his true importance is not the territory he conquered, but the legacy he leaves behind that was cultural, again, centered at these major cities, the most famous being Alexandria. Because the territory was broken up into various sections, we don't normally refer to this period as Alexander's empire, because Alexander at this point had died and there was no centralization of leadership. We do instead refer to this period as the Hellenistic age, this age where Alexander's love of Greek culture was spread throughout the area. But we also know that as Alexander moved across this region, there was other more local traditions and local information and achievements that started to blend with those Hellenistic or Greek traditions. So think about the areas he conquered. So he would have come into Egypt, and he would have been, and his people would have been exposed to all the Egyptian learning that we talked about in the first part of the course, all of the Mesopotamian, if you remember, technology, and then all of the Indian traditions and the Persian tradition. So really the Hellenistic world is an amalgam. It's an amalgamation, a building of a new culture that draws from all of these ancient traditions. Because the most urban center of this period after Alexander's death is Alexandria at Egypt, we look to Alexandria and the achievements there as really the pinnacle, the peak of Alexander's legacy and what we call a second Greek Golden Age. So by this point, the Greek city-states have passed their point of real achievement. Of course, Athens is still there and still a trading port. It hasn't disappeared, but it's part of something greater. There's really kind of, a power vacuum in this region. It's open to change. And so it's Alexandria specifically that becomes the center place of learning. Philosophy, the Epicureans, the Cynics, the Stoics, we mentioned when we were talking about Socrates, Aristotle, and Plato, that there's a real love of learning during this period and the love of wisdom. That continues in that Greek tradition at Alexandria. But also this appreciation of scientific discovery of the secular world. I'm sure some of these names look very familiar to you from math and science class, Archimedes and Galen, who was essentially considered to be like one of the first doctors, and Euclid's geometry, and the whole idea of the fascination with the heavens, right? It was later on people like Copernicus in modern Europe and Galileo in modern Europe that would look back to the research of those ancient Hellenistic Alexandrian astronomers. I guess the more important question here is why there was such success in terms of cultural achievement. If Alexander was so great in battle, why is it that after his death there are all of these cultural achievements that continue on? And the fact is, Alexander really did set the stage. I mean, because you could argue that, well, why does Alexander get credit for this if he's dead? But the fact is, Alexander had really built the foundation. He was somebody who was absolutely a patron for the arts and learning as he moved across Asia and established his leadership in these areas. He encouraged cultural achievement. He encouraged intellectual inquiry. He was fascinated by the achievements of the Chaldeans. Remember the Neo-Babylonians who were in Mesopotamia, and the Egyptian scientific learning. And so this tradition of Mesopotamian Near Eastern learning was a good match with that of the Greeks. And he really worked to encourage that. And as part of this new period, there was this interest in luxury and a demand for practical knowledge. They wanted to improve, not unlike when we talk about the Industrial Revolution as part of the modern age and people looking for new ways of living that would be much easier. The same can be said for the Hellenistic period. And Alexander absolutely can, at least in part, take credit for initiating this period. Hopefully this slide rings a little familiar with you from maybe some of your learning in middle school. Probably the two most famous elements of the Hellenistic age, neither of which exists because of a massive fire in Alexandria that would happen in this period, would be the library. The Library of Alexandria was said to house all of the information of the Hellenistic age, and of course would be a source of inspiration for new learning. And then of course the Grand Lighthouse of Alexandria, which is labeled as one of the ancient wonders of the world. Again, both of which burned down in the massive fire that was to take place here. So to wrap this up and to prepare you for tomorrow's activity, Alexander's legacy was ironically not political. He did conquer large territories, but after 12 years, at the time of his death, he wasn't able to really efficiently rule it. So in the end, the reason why he makes the cut, so to speak, in a world history class is because of the cultural foundation he built. It was this blending, this synthesis, or this blending of Greek and Mesopotamian and Persian and Indian and Egyptian traditions that would come together to create this golden age that, looking forward, the Romans would inherit. Keep in mind, too, as we move forward, that although there is this great cultural achievement in this golden age, there is a power vacuum. The Ptolemaic Empire was powerful in its own right, but not powerful enough eventually to withstand the growing Roman Empire from the west. And the generals who would assume control of the Balkan Peninsula